So I'm going to get started. My name is Helen. I am from Research Impact Canada, and I am a knowledge mobilization specialist there. So here today, we are talking about the knowledge mobilization toolkit that we worked on with ARIS. We collaborated together to make this repository of knowledge mobilization resources that people can use. And we're going to also do a deeper dive into 3 of these tools. And yeah, so I'm just going to start sharing my screen and we'll get started. So I just wanted to start by saying a land acknowledgement. Research Impact Canada is located at York University, and York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the House Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So acknowledging that this conference is virtual, please do take the time to acknowledge whatever land that you are currently on. So first of all, I kind of wanted to understand your base knowledge of what knowledge mobilization is and created this short quiz on Mentimeter. And this will help us understand our audience and you a bit better. So I'm just going to put this into the chat. If you can also copy and paste it from the slideshow, that would be great as well. And I'm going to share my screen for the Mentimeter. Great, I see people are starting to answer it, which is great to see. So far, let me just refresh this because I believe there's more than 2 people that have participated.
Helen, when I go to the link, I don't actually have a question there.
Oh.
Yeah, it just says Mentimeter Knowledge Mobilization Toolkit, and then there's nothing below it, so not sure.
Oh, you know what? Maybe it's because of the settings. Audience. Audience base. Share. Available to join via code. Presentation sharing. Quick.
And now it says thank you for your participation.
Okay.
As
this is not as successful as I was hoping. I might.
I think it's okay, Helen. Maybe we can move on. If
let's move on from this. Yep.
All good. I feel like technology issues are always an issue at any conference, including the virtual ones. Leah, that's a great idea. If people want to start typing in the chat how familiar they are with knowledge mobilization.
And so I'm just going to, let's see, sorry, on the current slide. So as we kind of see what people have been saying about what they know about knowledge mobilization and what kinds of words come to mind when you think of knowledge mobilization, I'm just going to give you a broad definition of what knowledge mobilization is. So it consists of activities and outputs that build awareness, disseminate findings, and enable use of research. And the goal is to maximize research impact. And really simply put, I like to think of knowledge mobilization as delivering the right message at the right time to the right person via the right channel. And there are a lot of definitions of knowledge mobilization. So there's a lot of terms and concepts that are used to describe aspects of knowledge mobilization. You might be common with the term knowledge translation, knowledge exchange, K-STAR, implementation, dissemination, knowledge management, research impact, research utilization, and broader impact. And those really are all terms related and part of knowledge mobilization. And what I really want to get to the point here is that knowledge mobilization is an umbrella term that encompasses all these different types of words. So why is knowledge mobilization important? We know that there is a gap between what really works in society, what research says people should be doing, and what is really actually happening. And we want to narrow this gap. And so that is why we, as knowledge brokers or knowledge mobilization practitioners, or whatever your position or role might be called, that's why we do what we do.
Helen, sorry, just to let you know, we can't see the slides in case, I'm not sure if you wanted to share them.
Oh, sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes, you just want to go into presentation mode of your PowerPoint.
Sorry about that.
Perfect.
Not an easy morning this morning. So, continuing why knowledge mobilization. Knowledge mobilization helps make research useful to society by supporting engaged scholarship from inception to impact. So, does everybody see my cursor moving here? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's community and there's campus or research institutions or universities. And basically what we do together is we do knowledge mobilization and we co-create together to make an impact. And this is adapted from a presentation that David Phipps provided for dissemination planning for the Future Skills Center in March this year. So the co-produced pathway to impact is one of many different theories or frameworks or models that describe the process for knowledge mobilization. So basically, the co-produced pathway to impact simplifies many of the complex models of knowledge mobilization. It is a logic model based on a framework for mapping the progress of research dissemination, uptake, and implementation impact. It illustrates that research impact occurs when university researchers collaborate with non-academic partners who produce the products, policies, and services that have impacts on the lives of end beneficiaries. Research impact is measured at the level of non-academic partners and identified by surveying research partners to create narrative case studies of research impacts. So all that is to say is that we as research industry, from my perspective, so coming from a knowledge mobilization perspective, we're working with community partners or nonprofit organizations, or basically and knowledge users to make research impact, and it is an iterative process. So we adapted, as Research Impact Canada, we adapted the co-produced impact pathway to impact to include activities for knowledge mobilization. So as you see, this might look familiar as it is the co-produced pathway to impact, but it includes some activities which are planning, brokering, dissemination, and evaluation and monitoring. And I'll get a little bit more into that in the next slide. So planning is what we have defined as production and synthesis of knowledge and creating new knowledge that is timely and relevant. And we've provided examples in the second column here. I'm going to let you look at that yourself, but I'm going to go through the definitions. Brokering, we've defined as building relationships or partnerships with users or stakeholders to better understand their goals, cultures, and factors of influence. Dissemination is presenting knowledge in different ways through a variety of channels and presenting knowledge to the necessary groups in appropriate formats. And then evaluation and monitoring is monitoring and evaluating your knowledge mobilization efforts and measuring your success. So obviously all of these different activities have different ways of being conducted, and it really depends on the scenario in which you're working with, your audience, and what works best for yourself. So getting into the Research Impact Canada Toolkit, as I mentioned before, this was a collaboration between Research Impact Canada and Advancing Research in Society, ARIS. And we had some criteria for the tools that we were looking for, which were that they had to be freely accessible tools on the internet, meaning that there wasn't a barrier to access, for example, like a paywall. They had to be tools as opposed to guides. And what we mean by that is that they were likely to be templates that could be directly applied to your own work, as opposed to maybe a guide, which is more of a informational reading material type resource. And then we wanted these tools to be able to be adapted to different contexts and help meet different knowledge mobilization needs and goals. And then through our process, we had knowledge mobilization and impact for Canada and the United States to help us review and rate the tools we had for usefulness, user-friendliness, applicability, and access. And that's how we kind of made a short list of tools that are currently sitting on the Research Impact Canada resources webpage. So this is just the webpage for you to see. Each tool is represented by a card on the webpage, and so you can click further into each tool, and then that's how it'll lead you eventually to the tool that it sits on whoever the tool creator's website is. And then we also have functions that you can filter for topic, and you can also filter for resource type, or even search for a keyword for if you're looking for a specific tool or a specific topic of knowledge mobilization. So now we've kind of changed the format of how we're presenting this, because we wanted to make sure that the recording recorded all of the presentation. So we're going to do a deeper dive and an exploration of the tools. The first one being the plain language writing checklist with Srdjana. Then we'll go through the disseminating findings checklist and guide with myself. And then last but not least, the guide to impact planning with Dewi Hannon. So I am now going to hand it over to Srdjana.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with all of you. So as Helen mentioned, I will be telling you more about using the plain language checklist, and hopefully you're able to download it from the conference website. And if not, it is available on the website that Helen was mentioning earlier. So you can always get that afterwards. So I'll just share my screen and then we can start looking at the checklist. So can everybody see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, and I see that people were able to download the resources, so that's great. I apologize, I have not actually uploaded my slide deck, but I can do that right after. So if you would like to refer to have it as a reference, you can do that. Okay, so just to sort of give you a little bit of an overview, I guess, of who I am. So I am a program manager in the knowledge translation program. So again, like Helen said, knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization are really synonymous terms and mostly depend on sort of you know, the background that you come from. So in Canada, when we talk about knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization, and we come from a sort of more health science or research area, then often we'll use the knowledge translation term, but it's really synonymous. So yeah, my program is part of the Hospital for Sick Children, or SickKids for short, and we're located in Toronto, Canada. And really the mandate of our program is, you know, building capacity for knowledge mobilization. So we do that in a lot of different ways. One is that we create a lot of training opportunities opportunities both for our staff as well as for external participants. We provide consultations on knowledge mobilization and implementation, that this is mostly within the walls of the hospital. And then we actually create a lot of resources and tools. And one of them is this plain language writing checklist, which we're very happy that is part of the knowledge mobilization toolkit that we're talking about today. So I wanted to kind of just start and ask the group, you know, when you hear the term plain language, what is it that you think of? What are some of the definitions that you've heard? And you can just type it in the chat and I'll read it out, or raise your hand. If you click on the participant section, you'll kind of see all the participants and have the raise hand option too. So you can unmute yourself and just let me know. So people are saying, no jargon, layman's terms, accessible to most, that's right. Words and descriptions that regular people, quote unquote, can understand, simple, easy to understand, accessible language, no acronyms, 8th grade reading level. Excellent. So those are some really good examples and sort of different ways that we think of plain language. But I'm going to share this definition with you, which I think is a really nice one because it really nicely fits with the knowledge mobilization principles. So plain language is communication that your audience can understand the first time they read or hear it. Material is considered to be in plain language if your audience can find what they need, understand what they find, and use what they find to meet their needs. So if we look here in this definition, really, we're always tailoring the way we communicate depending on who our audience is, right? So theoretically, you really should be using plain language all the time, according to this definition, not just, you know, sort of the layman term talking to the general public. And so in a way, maybe it could be even better if it was clear language, but anyways, we call it plain language, right? And it's very much so this piece on focusing on the audience, very important for knowledge mobilization, because we're always creating knowledge mobilization products targeted towards specific audiences, because that's the most effective way that people will take up information, whether it comes from research or anywhere else. And we want them to understand what they're reading, and we want them to be able to use it, right? So very kind of practice focused. So really helping with moving that research evidence into practice. And I think it's really important to realize that, you know, if we look at these statistics, so in US and Canada actually have quite similar statistics. So if we look for adults over the age of 16, we see that almost 50% of them have actually trouble reading text and documents that are kind of required for normal, you know, sort of functioning in an industrialized nations like Canada and the US. So quite a large number, right? Even over 50, between 50 and 60, depending whether it's Canada or US, have trouble understanding numbers and different sort of mathematical functions that are used in everyday life. And around 60% have problem solving, have trouble using technology to problem solve. Right. So really kind of, and this is, you know, not uncommon for many countries around the world. So we really have to kind of be mindful of how we communicate almost anything that we communicate, right? Whether it's research-based evidence or really just, you know, sort of everyday life things like even emails and things like that. So I think what it, you know, really the sort of this toolkit, this checklist is really kind of, you can use it almost with anything, but particularly when you're talking about trying to create research impact, so trying to move that research evidence into practice, and when you're trying to, you know, engage the public. And really because, you know, your goal is really always to improve understanding of what you're trying to share. And this improved understanding will help you facilitate the buy-in and increase uptake by your audience. And I just kind of wanted to throw this on here. So just to show you that really, according to this definition, we really, like I said, should be using plain language every time we're communicating, whether it's written or oral forms of communication. So, you know, whether you're talking about educational materials, maybe you're presenting at a conference or writing emails, or, you know, you're creating some kind of a presentation, recording a video, whatever it may be. So you know, how do you create plain language communication? So we really, you know, this all kind of stemmed from, we did a big sort of needs assessment across the hospital in all different areas. We have research, a research institute, we have a clinical, obviously we're a hospital, and we have a lot of sort of, you know, corporate / support staff. And there was a kind of, and you know, perhaps it's because it's a pediatric hospital, but there was very much this kind of strong voice that we really need a lot of tools and supports for plain language communication. People really valued this. And so this is one of the things that we've created. And so it's this plain language writing checklist, which you just see the first page of on here, and hopefully you can download it. And I see that Connie has posted a link where you can download it. So thank you for that. So let's just go through some of the sort of aspects of what's in the checklist, and then we'll practice with a few examples. And then if we have some time, we can also just get you to practice on a paragraph and apply this this checklist. So the three kind of key categories of strategies that we see on the checklist are: number one, what kind of words are you going to use? Number two, to think about design and formatting. And then number three, to consider knowledge mobilization principles. And this is, you know, could be really applied to any kind of document that you have, you know, whether it's a written document or, you know, a script for a video or anything like that. And, you know, there are some additional tweaks you might want to consider depending on, you know, what type of a product you're looking at. But this really, these principles apply to almost anything. So the first thing, you know, and it's a common thing I saw many of you post that in the chat, is just using familiar words, right? So using the simplest words to express your ideas accurately. So we're not really, you know, often we hear this sort of concept of dumbing it down, quote unquote, which, you know, I don't love because I think it's sort of, you know, expressing yourself in the simplest and sort of most clear way is actually sometimes quite difficult, and more difficult than using big words. So, you know, trying to figure out what are those, you know, sort of simplest words that you can use, avoiding jargon. So we saw a lot of people mention that. Trying to spell out all acronyms and abbreviations, especially the first time around, right? Always trying to define them. And if you cannot avoid technical terms and jargon, you know, sometimes, especially let's say for communicating, you know, information in healthcare, you might have, you know, very complex disease name or something like that. You know, you will have to use it, but trying to make sure that you always define it at the beginning. So here are some examples of words that I wanted to throw on here. So I was wondering if people could tell me what would be a more sort of simple way to say ascertain. Just type it in the chat. Sorry, I'm just having my chat is, oh, okay. Decide, determine, find, discover. Yeah, exactly. So find out, discover. Awesome. That's great. What about cease? Well, how could we say cease in a different way? Stop. Exactly. Perfect. End. That's great. What about initiate? Start. Exactly. Begin. Facilitate. Help. Support. Coordinate, run, help. Yeah, I love it. Lots of great example. Exactly. Help, ease, assist. And so as you see, right, there's lots of sort of word choices. And of course, using a thesaurus always helps, right, with these types of things. So for interim, we could say temporary. For inaugural, we could say first, right? So thanks for participating in the chat. So the next thing we often talk about when we're talking about making communication plain, we talk about using pronouns. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so all of these things are listed on the checklist. And basically, you know, you would just take your document, you would read it, you would kind of become familiar with it, and then you would go through the checklist and it would tell you about all of these things. Okay, so have you picked the simplest words? Have you used pronouns wherever you can, right? And you would sort of just review your document in response to some of the pointers that are on the checklist. So using pronouns, right? So pronouns are those words that replace nouns like you, she, they, him, it. And they really clarify or can help you clarify who's doing what, right? And they're really there to engage the reader. Because, you know, if you say, and you'll see in some examples where I have how they can help engage the reader, but it's also really important to define who and what your pronouns refer to, right? Because sometimes it can be a little bit unclear if you haven't done that. So for example, we have the sentence where we say compensation will be provided upon completion of the survey. So it's not really clear who will be providing the compensation and to whom, right? But if we rewrite this sentence when we say, when you finish the survey, the research coordinator will give you $10. Now you've added these two pronouns and, you know, added in some additional information, and all of a sudden the sentence becomes much more clear, much more direct, and sort of much more action oriented. You're telling the reader exactly what you want them to do, and they're more likely to make that action happen. So I have two more sentences on here. And how do you think you might improve these or make them more plain language by using some pronouns? So for example, the first one, the request should be sent to the administrator. So yes, using active voice, that's going to be the next thing we'll talk about. Thank you, Mary, for sharing that. But could somebody take a stab to rewrite this using pronouns? The first sentence. You should send the request to the administrator. I like it, right? So using you. So I've had here, send your request to the administrator, but I like you should send it to. Please send the request to Bob. Julie's suggesting that. That sounds great as well, right? So many different ways that we can, you know, change sentences and make them more clear and more action oriented. What about latecomers will have appointments rescheduled? If you are late, your appointment will be rescheduled, Sylvia shares with us. Awesome. Connie says, we will reschedule appointments for latecomers. All ocean science administrators are called BAP. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. So I said, if you are late, we will reschedule your appointment. So again, added two pronouns there, you and your, and it's just become sort of much more clear, much more direct. And somebody noticed that, you know, by actually often when you add pronouns, you actually can, what you end up doing is that you end up rewriting from a passive tense to an active, which is, sorry, a passive voice, from a passive voice to active voice, which is exactly what the next thing is that we're talking about. So this is also a common thing. It's often also a big issue when we're talking to people who, you know, come from a research background, because we're really used to writing, you know, research papers in this passive voice, right? So we say, you know, the data was collected and analyzed. And so this is not really ideal when we're talking about plain language. We want to sort of reword those things. So let's see here. So what is passive voice? So we have this sentence, the survey was reviewed by 2 experts in survey methodology. So was reviewed is the verb and 2 experts is the subject. And here we all, you know, have sort of the verb is comes before the subject. It's almost acting on the subject. So this would be passive voice. And then if we reword that into 2 were experts in survey methodology reviewed the survey, now the subject is acting, like it's actually doing the action, right? So now this becomes active voice. And we always want to try using active voice when we're trying to create plain language communication. So for example, this sentence, the students were given their grades by the teacher. Could we have some examples of how we might rewrite that? Anybody want to put it in the chat? What would be the active voice version of this sentence? The teacher give the students their grades. Thank you. Yeah. So the teacher gave the students their grades. Perfect. It's exactly what I have as well. So, you know, with a little bit of practice, you start really being able to flip these quite quickly. Okay, so the next thing that the checklist asks you to consider is different design and sort of formatting principles. So one kind of important piece is, you know, when you see sort of just like a paragraph with no structure to it, it's, you know, often a turnoff. I think especially in this day and age where we really tend to scan information, whether it's on the web or even in print. So it, you know, it might sort of be people might not even want to read it when they see something like that. So we really want to try to think of chunking the information. So we often will talk about using headings, right? So sort of labeling what each section is talking about. And that way, when people scan, they see like, okay, this is giving me, you know, sort of information about a specific topic that I'm really interested in. So I'm just going to dive more deeper into this. We often talk about trying to use lists. So write bullet points. So, you know, instead of having a paragraph, you might break it down and list things. I actually saw somebody, so Q&A, so question and answer. So thinking about, let's say, common questions. So let's say you have some kind of a brochure that's explaining, you know, how to use a certain facility. And the common questions that you always get is, you know, how do I get to, you know, how do I do this? And so you would start off on your brochure with that question and then provide the answer to it. So I actually saw somebody, Susan, when we had that sentence about rescheduling appointments, she had a late question mark, please reschedule your appointment. So that's kind of, you know, one of those sort of ideas. And then thinking about creating tables wherever that's needed. That's often good for a numerical type of information or comparing two different things. And then we also want to think about, you know, using images as much as we can to support our information, so that there isn't always a time and place for that. But when there is, that's a really good way to enhance the information. Using colors in a right way. So, you know, writing. So, you know, as you can see in my slides, I have, you know, dark font on a light background. You always want to make sure that you're taking that into consideration and in applying the accessibility principles. And then thinking about white space as well. So, you know, how do you give your message room to breathe? So here's an example. This is a label from allergy tablets. As you can see, it's sort of just a bunch of, you know, text. There is a little bit of headings, but it's pretty jumbled together, maybe kind of off-putting at first. And then here's how it might be redesigned. So as you can see, there's a lot of the information was sort of listed using bullet points. There's a lot more white space or a lot more kind of areas around the text that just make it much more easy for your eye to find the information that it's looking for. The headings are much larger font and more sort of easy to find, and it's really listed now in a table as opposed to a paragraph. Susan says, I love this. Also, when we are mentoring undergraduates in science communication, helping them with better posters and presentations, we have to talk about attending to the audience using plain language, but know how to code switch if needing to talk about their research with lab or potential employers. Exactly, right? So that's a perfect example of sort of tailoring your message to your audience, and you were not going to be using the same type of language for, you know, like we said, to the general public versus maybe to their potential employers. So really great example. Thank you for sharing that, Susan. And then the final kind of section that the checklist talks about is thinking about knowledge mobilization principles. So really thinking about that audience, who are you tailoring these messages to? And that almost should be at the forefront, right? That's something you should be thinking about first, because that'll help you determine what type of language you're going to be using, what is considered jargon and what's not, right? Because something that might be considered jargon to the general public won't be considered jargon if you're talking to, let's say, doctor or a principal investigator in a study. So, and that'll also help you think of, what's the appropriate kind of channel. Should you be creating an infographic, or is it better to have a brochure, or is it better to have, an abstract from a paper, or whatever it may be. And thinking about really communicating for your audience and not for yourself. So thinking about what kind of information they really need and making sure that it's found there, right? And we talk about these two things, these kind of two terms, your SMITs and BLAMs, and that's also on the checklist. So thinking about SMIT, which is your single most important thing, and BLAM, which is your bottom line actionable message. So trying to really make sure that those stand out, right? What is the bottom, like, what are you really trying to communicate? What's that most important thing? And what do you want people to do as a result of that information? So always thinking about those two things. And I just wanted to say that, it's great to have these checklists and to kind of review the information yourself, but really the best way that we can kind of get feedback on something that we're writing is that we share it with a member of the target audience and we get them to tell us whether something makes sense or not. So when we're creating at the hospital, brochures geared towards parents and children and patients, we try to get them to review the brochure before we finalize it, because that will really ultimately be the best test of whether something's plain language enough or not. Mary says, are there tech tools you would recommend for editing to achieve different levels of reading lab, like Grammarly? Yeah, so that's a great question. So I didn't really include that just because I was focusing on the checklist, but there are actually some. So when we talk about reading levels, we often have requirements, depending on sort of your organization might have requirements, or, if you're writing, let's say, a grant proposal, there might be requirements, whether it should be grade 6, grade 8, whatever that may be. And there's many kind of reading calculators out there that can give you sort of a number, like, okay, this document is at a grade 6 reading level. There's some that are built into Word. I tend to use this thing called readability consensus calculator, and I can find a link for it and post it when I'm done talking, because it gives you actually 5 different calculators and then takes the average of what they're all saying and spits it out. So that's one thing that I like. However, be mindful of the fact that those calculators only talk about, or only take into consideration, one, the how complex the words are. So how many syllables the words you're using have, how many words in a sentence, and really kind of the structure of the sentences that you have, but they don't take into consideration the meaning, right? They can't. It's just an algorithm that kind of thinks of complexity of sentences. So that's why it's always best to try to have somebody else read the document. Another thing that I really use is called Hemingway editor. I'll type it in. So Hemingway editor, it's online, it's free, and you would paste your text and then it would kind of highlight where you have passive voice, where you have some words that could be simplified. And it gives you also a great reading level as well. And then so you can type directly into it and kind of edit things. But Grammarly is one of those as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Mary. Kate says we use, she's suggesting, so SEO Scout. So I haven't actually used that one. That will be, and yes, I'll take a look at that one. So thank you for sharing that one. Excellent. So my idea at this stage was that I was going to share this document with you, but but unfortunately it's not the way that we've had the Zoom set up for today, is that I can't pop this document in the chat for you. So I'm not sure if you were able to download this document or not. Helen, do you think we have time for people to kind of take a stab at practicing some of these principles by rewriting this text? or we could really leave it to them to do it in their own. You're muted, sorry.
Yeah, I think we have a few minutes.
Yeah, so do people have this document? Were they able to download it from the conference website? If the majority hasn't been, then it's kind of not going to be very effective. Mary says she was able to. So yeah, I see that people haven't. So why don't we do that? Why don't we just take 5 minutes and try to, you have hopefully the checklist as well. Try to take a stab and kind of making some of these, this document a little more plain language. And then we can talk about how your experience after those 5 minutes and just letting us know how you think. So let's take 5 minutes. So it's 12:13 on my time, which is probably not everybody else's time, but just 5 minutes from now and we can come back. Okay, so let's come back. I know that's not super long and, normally these things take a fair bit longer, even just, reading the document once and then kind of thinking about each sentence on its own. But could people maybe put in the chat sort of if they attempted to apply the checklist, what were your sort of general thoughts around trying to rewrite something with the plain language principles in mind? You're also welcome to unmute yourself if you'd prefer just to talk. So Therese says pronouns was the biggest. Oh, that's good. Yeah, so just kind of making that more direct. Susan says talking to a person and visualize the person I was talking to. I like that. Yeah, I think that's really helpful, actually. I always try to do the same, really try to put myself in the shoes of the people who will be reading the document and sort of get in that frame of mind. So I really like that advice. So Jessica says organizing the content appropriately. So that's right? So this was just sort of a bunch of paragraphs. Wasn't really clearly organized, but how can you really organize that information? Maybe you would throw in some headings. Maybe it's about, sort of what's advice. Maybe you put some bullet points there in terms of like, listing the types of foods that Canadians should consume if they're trying to create healthy eating habits. Mary says, say what you should do, not what you shouldn't do. Okay, so that positive versus negative framing. So that's a really good point as well, which we didn't talk about. But there's always sort of that debate of whether some type of information should be framed in a positive way versus a negative. There is some research that shows positive framing is actually more effective, but sometimes sort of negative framing in the way that you scare people, like you might just throw out some really scary statistic and that'll scare them into action. So that's a great point, Mary. Sandra says, it was hard to think about how to make the phrases like whole grain foods or protein foods plain language, but still specific. Exactly. And that's common. It's a common problem. So it's really about often what people will do, they might give examples. So, you might still have to say whole grain foods, but then in the bracket, or, you might have like a table where you would actually give examples of what those whole grain foods are. And that way you might make it more accessible for people. Susan says, eliminating repetition and condensing the message. Exactly. Really good point. Trying to be, so not just thinking about sort of picking the easiest words. And that's something that is on the checklist, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but really thinking about saying things with the least number of words that's necessary and keeping sentence length manageable, right? So we don't want run-on sentences, and we typically don't want sentences that have more than one concept or one thought in them. And Liz says, thinking about how to use a bullet list to make information more concise and organizing the information. So yeah, exactly. Great points. Thank you all. That was, those are some great insights. And I think the key, in my opinion, is really just trying to do, practicing. Like this won't be easy the first time around. It probably isn't something you should do if especially with writing for the public or for the general audiences. You might not want to do it all in one day. You might want to edit and then come back in a couple of days. I always, no matter how much I do this, see something else that comes up and I'm like, oh, I totally didn't see that. I could have made this even more simple. And then really thinking about leaving time for user testing is my biggest sort of advice, I would say, which is often not possible, sort of not budgeted for, but I really, really strongly encourage you to try that. We have some more comments. So Susan says using exclamation and interrogation, and then Nancy talks about removing unneeded words like due to the fact. Exactly, like you don't need to say due to the fact. You can just say, since the menu options are often unhealthy, not due to the fact that the menu options are often unhealthy, and some stuff like that. Okay, so I think that hopefully gives you the taste of the checklist and the things that are on it. Again, there is much more in there than what I was able to share with you today. I also want to say there's a fair number of resources out there and some free to access e-learning modules around this. But ultimately, it's really about just practicing and taking the time to think about plain language and clear communication. So I think we have a few minutes. I could take maybe a couple of questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, we can just move on to the next tool. Okay, sounds like people are good. So maybe if you think of anything, you can just pop it in the chat. I'll be here. I can always answer any questions you have. You can also just grab my email address and email me. Thank you for your time. And I'll hand it over to Helen, I believe.
Thank you, Srdjana. So we are going to move on to the next tool, which is the Disseminating Findings Checklist and Guide. So I'm going to share my screen. So I just wanted to put a disclaimer out there that I am not associated with the creation of this tool. And this presentation was created based on resources provided by the tool creators listed above. So Dina, Claire, Sarah, and Karen, who are part of the Cochrane organization in various ways.
Helen, just an FYI, you're not sharing your screen yet.
Oh, sorry. Does everybody see that now?
Yes, but not in presentation mode.
Okay. Yep, got it.
Yep, perfect.
Thank you. So for those who are unfamiliar with Cochrane, a Cochrane review is a type of systematic review, typically in healthcare and health policy, that is published in their database systematic reviews. So what's particularly special or different about a Cochrane review is that it's prepared and maintained using specific methodologies described in their handbook. And systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials provide the clearest evidence for the benefits of a healthcare intervention. So even though this might be this tool is very particular to Cochrane reviews, it can be applied in a general context, in which I will get into that. But knowledge translation in the Cochrane organization is the process of supporting the use of health evidence from high quality, trusted, systematic reviews by those who need it to make health decisions. And their audiences are typically consumers and the public, healthcare practitioners, policy and healthcare managers, as well as researchers and research funders. So knowledge translation in Cochrane means products presenting evidence from their reviews, and they're packaged and disseminated to these audiences in different ways. So examples of these products might include press releases, social media, plain language summaries, podcasts, and journal columns. And really the goals are to provide reasonable representation of the evidence so that information is sufficiently complete, nuanced, and unbiased, and to provide a good user experience. So that means that information is easy to find and understand, it is useful and credible, and the information is desirable and non-alienating. A little bit more about this checklist is that it's a tool for anyone presenting or preparing a dissemination product based on a Cochrane intervention review. But again, as I mentioned before, that it can be applied to a broader context. The checklist aims to improve the quality and consistency of dissemination products that present findings, and it also aims to improve communication with non-experts. So people who are not familiar with systematic review methodology. So how might we improve quality and consistency when disseminating the results of systematic reviews? It's regardless of product type, media, and language, and is for people creating, disseminating products across people with different skill sets, times, and resources. So this is just a general overview of the checklist. It comes with a one-page overview and then 7 pages with details, as well as a full guidance with examples and references. So using the checklist, these are kind of do's and don'ts for using this tool. And so for disseminating findings from Cochrane intervention reviews, but again, it is relevant for other types of reviews and research too. It's for products that present findings, so it's not just for building awareness about a review. And the focus is on dissemination to non-experts, so people not familiar with the scientific process or the systematic review methodology. And it's for creating both individual product content and templates, as well as it is a set of requirements, meaning that it is a recipe or a magic bullet for your knowledge mobilization process. So what I found that was most useful with this tool was the one-page overview dissemination checklist, which I will go through these various points. So firstly, have you involved your target audience or sought their feedback? So oftentimes you have to decide who your target audience is. And when you're creating your individual products, consider whether it is possible to show the product in advance to a member of your target audience. And when developing product templates or for larger ongoing products, carry at least one cycle of user feedback from 3 or 4 people to represent your target audience. Have you used plain language? I won't get into this too much because we just had a full tool on using plain language, but what constitutes as plain language depends on your target audience. Have you used words in your title that your target audience is likely to search for, recognize, and find relevant? So at a minimum, that means using words that your target audience finds relevant. So for example, in a health context, it might be the treatment for a condition that they're familiar with, and try to avoid very long titles. Have you communicated to your target audience that this product is relevant to them? So decide whether you need to make it clear to your audience that this product is relevant to them. So that means that, for example, would they likely not pay attention to the product or not realize that it is relevant to them unless you clearly state this? Have you structured the content so people can find key messages, then access more detail if they want? So that means providing information as a reference or link where they can find the full review so that they can see more detailed information. And also, ideally, this will help people find the information that is most important to them by providing and preparing different layers of information. So giving them the opportunity to access more detail on demand. And have you made the content more, sorry, I realized I wasn't in presentation view. Have you made the content easy for people to, have you made the content easy for people to quickly scan and read? So that means that at a minimum for text-based products, you're putting the most important context first and making it easy to spot. Have you shown that the evidence involves real people? So real people referring to making it more tangible, like women, children, rather than participants. And again, a lot of the examples provided are in a healthcare context, but of course, please apply it to whoever your target audience is. Have you specified the population interventions, comparisons, and outcomes? So it's indicating the review's population, intervention, and outcomes of interest. So the scope of the review, and using actual name and words like intervention and outcome. Also, ideally, consider whether you need to provide a more detailed description of the population as well. And again, that goes back to providing further detail if people so choose to look that up further. Have you stated this information is from a systematic review? So that means that explaining in more detail what a systematic review is if they don't understand it, and typically non-experts will not understand what a systematic review is, and indicating that a systematic review is not a single study, but it includes a number of studies. And then, have you specified how up-to-date the review is? So including the review's publication year, because people want to find out whether or not the information that you're providing is up to date. Have you avoided misleading presentations and interpretations of the effects? So that means that consider engaging your target audience to decide which outcomes to focus on, as well as reporting the most important, again, this is in a healthcare context, but reporting the most important benefits and harms, including ones for which authors find no evidence. So really is, this goes back to making sure that you're providing a clear and concise key message. And have you used numbers to present the findings? And have you used absolute numbers and labeled numbers clearly? So always try to label your numbers that you're presenting to indicate what these numbers are referring to. So for example, that might be 12 out of children, or another example is 3 days per year. And consider using tables or figures to present these numbers. So people may prefer to insert numbers in the middle of text, which that can be found as off-putting or too complicated. And have you described the certainty of the evidence? So at a minimum, don't state that an intervention or the outcome of something works or doesn't work if the certainty is not significant. Again, this this is science jargon, but it's making sure that you're not misleading your audience. And then, have you presented your findings in more than one way? People consume information in different ways. So it's consider using both words and numbers and different types of media to present your findings. So where the topic or findings may be upsetting, controversial, or disappointing, have you handled it sensitively? So acknowledge it if it is, and explore this further through gathering feedback from your target audience on how to handle it. Have you made it clear that this review was prepared by Cochrane or who prepared the dissemination product? So oftentimes people want to know who prepared the information that they're being presented to. So they want to know the credibility of the people presenting the information. So explain, for example, what sort of organization Cochrane is. It's an international, independent, non-governmental, non-profit organization. So do this as either part of your product or through is it easy for people to find information about who the review authors are, how they're funded, and if there are any conflicts of interest? So you want to provide, again, who wrote the review or your products or whoever you're whatever information you're providing, and make that information openly available. And then be sure to also address how they were funded, as well as any conflicts of interest in case there might be any biases to the information that is being presented. And lastly, have you avoided giving recommendations? So at a minimum, do not give, it's recommended to not give recommendations in your dissemination product, but I feel in this case that it really depends on your scenario and your knowledge mobilization plan. So that is a general overview of the checklist, and the full checklist and guidance can be found at this link, in which one of my colleagues will also put this link in the chat in case you would like to explore further. So I'm providing you with layers of information on how to discover more. And this is the Disseminating Findings Checklist and Guide on our resources website. So just to give you a bit of an overview of how we structure our knowledge mobilization toolkit, is that we give you a general overview on what the tool might entail. So in this case, the Disseminating Findings Checklist and Guide, as well as some comments that our reviewers said. So it might be what they found helpful, what they might point out specifically, or sections of the tool that they might find helpful. And then that can also be found again on our resources webpage on the Research Impact Canada website. So just for a discussion, and because again, due to some technical difficulties, I'm not going to try to go through the Mentimeter kind of thing again, but in the chat, can you please point out, are there any points in the dissemination checklist that stand out to you? So I'm just going to give a few moments to get that information from the chat. So for example, I think that what really stands out to me in the dissemination checklist is that is really understanding your target audience and getting that feedback from your target audience and co-creating with them to make an effective product. I think that that's one of the points that I find that are super helpful for this tool. And Srdjana said, I like the alignment with the plain language checklist, which is good. I think that's also very important. And I think that it works well with each other as well. Okay. And challenges that you've encountered that may be mitigated if you had a resource like this checklist. So for example, I think that for myself, when I'm doing knowledge mobilization products, it's making it very tangible, giving examples to people that are relevant to them. So it's speaking in terms of people, but what types of people? Are they students? Are they researchers? So that's relevant to my work, for example. Or making sure that the information is the most important information is presented up front. So are there any examples that or challenges that you think would help you if you had a resource like this checklist? Mary did mention that it seems like it's a very helpful approach for faculty trying to disseminate findings, and that's definitely true. I think that for researchers, having people such as knowledge mobilization professionals or knowledge brokers to work through this checklist together would be very helpful. And also Nancy mentioned that the advice for carrying out small cycles of feedback is helpful in building from there. And then Travis said, it's great to share with collaborators to keep on the same page and share projects. And I certainly can see the helpfulness in terms of being on the same page and shared projects, although they are, Srdjana did mention, there's great alignment with the plain language checklist, that these are not necessarily shared projects, but that they do elicit this. Okay, so great. And Nancy did mention, I think that the faculty I work with would benefit from these principles when they're developing surveys to collect feedback on their broader impact activities. So thank you everyone that contributed to this discussion. And now I am going to hand it over to Dewi to talk about the her next tool, which is like that. On to the third tool.
Yes, thanks, Helen. I want to start with saying thank you to Helen for inviting me to speak at this summit. I will try to share my screen. Okay, I guess it should be seen by everyone now. If not, please let me know.
Yep, we can see it, Dewi.
Yeah, perfect. I hope you can hear me as well. There's some background noise here, but I can't do anything about that, so I'm sorry. Okay, so I will give a quick presentation on the guide to impact planning. But first, I will start by introducing myself. So my name is Dewi Hannon. I am a clinical psychologist by training, but started working in research right after my studies. I have been working at Ghent University, where I developed the guide to impact planning together with the people who were mentioned in the previous slide. At the moment, I am working at VIVES University College, which is located in a smaller city in Belgium called Kortrijk. And within VIVES, we have several centers of expertise, and I work at the Center of Expertise for Social Innovation. I am also a lecturer at the same institution within the Bachelor for Applied Psychology. The toolkit, which we call the Guide to Impact Planning, was actually created as a deliverable for a European project called Accomplish, which stands for Accelerate Co-Creation by setting up a multi-actor platform for impact from social sciences and humanities. The focus, therefore, is on impact planning tools, specifically within the field of social sciences and humanities. Our aim was mainly to provide researchers and policymakers with an easy to use guide. So actually it is a guide, but there are plenty of tools inside the guide to use. And the guide also explains the importance of impact planning and gives some insight in various definitions considering impact. And this way we want to encourage researchers and policymakers to plan the impact their research might have. And ideally, this is done early on in the research process, preferably at the very start. Within research, it is also often considered necessary to plan impact while writing a research proposal in order to receive funding. So also for this purpose, the guide might be very useful. In the guide, we start with a quick definition of impact. Within the field of impact and valorization, there are various concepts being used. Impact really refers to the effect of research or a project, both within and beyond the academic field. So there are various types of impact. Impact can be new knowledge, which is situated within the academic field, but impact can also be on a cultural level. For example, destigmatization of certain minority groups within society can be on an economic level, for example, job creation, on an environmental level, for example, awareness of climate change, and so on. I would like to briefly explain the difference between assessing, planning, and measuring of impact. Impact assessment refers to a system for assessing the relevance of research. This often includes the evaluation of research output and impact and the relevance to society. Impact planning refers to the stage at the beginning of a research process where the possible impact is already a point of reflection and plans are being made for how to achieve this impact. Impact tracking refers to researchers tracking the impact of their research. For example, they might track down the attention their research gets in mainstream media. There are certain tools you can use for this. An example is Altmetric. In our guide to impact planning, we also hold a specific focus on co-creation. Co-creation refers to the collaboration between various actors actively joining forces to tackle shared challenges. At Ghent University, within the Accomplished project, we also developed a guide to co-creation. Co-creation often finds place with 4 major sectors. You see these sectors here on the slide. This is often referred to as the quadruple helix. It is a difficult word, but it consists of academia and universities, industry and business, government and public sector, and civil society. In the guide to co-creation, you can find tips and tricks on how to collaborate with various stakeholders and how to hold co-creation sessions. At the beginning of research, or even better when writing down your ID, you should try to consider the various stakeholders involved in your ID. And one way to do this is through stakeholder mapping. This is also something we explain quite thoroughly in the guide to impact planning. An important step in both co-creation and impact planning is the identification of stakeholders. This is step 1. So you can start by brainstorming on all the people who could be affected by your ID, might have an influence themselves, or could have an interest in the success or even in the failure of your work. In the next phase, you should try to analyze the perspectives and interests of each stakeholder. This way, it is possible to estimate to what extent a stakeholder will be motivated to be engaged throughout the research process. Several topics to take into account in this analysis are the influence a stakeholder has and the willingness to engage. Additionally, it might be interesting to create a visualization of the relationships between these various stakeholders and between the stakeholders themselves and certain objectives. And this is called step 3, mapping. At this point, you can also start thinking about when you want to engage stakeholders in your project. They might be called into the project at a certain point. Sometimes you need one stakeholder early on in the project to help find participants to your study, while other stakeholders might be of more interest when you want to disseminate your results. For example, when you need a certain context with media. On the other hand, stakeholders can also be engaged in advance before the start of a research process, where researchers and stakeholders define problems together, and this is often done by co-creation. Finally, you need to consider which stakeholders you eventually want to engage in your research. It is often not feasible to engage with all stakeholders at the same level of intensity and at the same time. So you need to prioritize who to contact first. Possible stakeholders listed here are the governments, citizens, policymakers, researchers, consumers, end users, industry shareholders, interest groups, and so on. So from my previous slide, it should be clear by now that stakeholders can have different roles within a project. So try to get a hold of this early on in your project. Might they be involved as a partner or as an informant, for example, by delivering information that is crucial to your research, as evaluators of your outcome, or as a communicator for your results to a broader public or to the target group. And what I would like to propose at this point in the presentation is that we get started with an exercise to familiarize ourselves with the concept of stakeholder mapping. So I don't know if most of you brought an idea or have a project in mind which they could use to practice and answer these questions. Anyhow, I don't think we won't be able to have a large discussion about everyone's project afterwards, but it could give you an idea on how to do this. Therefore, I would like you all to answer these questions by yourselves. You can take a piece of paper or a Word document and try to answer. Try to list the possible stakeholders who could benefit or be affected by or help with your research or project or the idea that you have in mind. Try to think on what roles they could play during the research or your project process. And eventually maybe already try to create some kind of visualization of the relationship between these various actors, these stakeholders, and between the stakeholders and their objectives, roles or tasks that they would play within the project. So I would like to give you all 2 or 3 minutes to try and do this, but maybe put in the chat if they are ready, and then we can see if there's some time to discuss something. But I do have an example myself to show to you as well. So maybe 3 minutes from now on, and meanwhile I will search for the chat box because I can't see it. So I don't know if this is an easy or a difficult task for you guys to do. But maybe those people who have already finished the exercise, they can put in the chat the stakeholders they thought about that could be relevant to their research. It might be of interest to others as well. Like, and you have an idea, oh, yeah, I didn't think about this one or that one. Could be interesting to see what kind of stakeholders you all are thinking about in specific situations. Nancy says government agency administrators, which is a really relevant stakeholder. I think if you get them engaged early on in a project, it might be very interesting. I do know it's an exercise that would take some more time to fill out more in detail, and you need to brainstorm a bit on who could be of interest to your project. Are there other stakeholders you guys are thinking about? For a blue economy research project, we are considering different levels from fishers and landowners to wind energy investors to planning agencies. Yes, perfectly. You have stakeholders from different areas. So the fishers themselves, landowners, but also the investors, which is more the business side of the stakeholders. So yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so I propose that we go further with the presentation. So I will show you an example of a project I just started working on within our Center of Expertise. It's a Horizon 2020 project. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that because it's a European project funded by the European Union. And within the project, we want to co-create resilient and sustainable food systems each country involved has a specific focus point considering this common aim. And within Belgium, we are focusing on elderly people in care situations or still living at home, but who can't prepare meals for themselves anymore and need to rely on meal delivery companies. So this is a bit of the situation of the project. And then if I put this in a stakeholder mapping, so the project is a European project, Horizon 2020, which makes the board of this project the overall coordinator. They are also the communicator within the project since they focus largely on dissemination of the results. The city of Bruges showed their interest early on within the timeframe of project proposal. So they wanted to do something in co-creation with elderly people living in Bruges or its region. And they actually will be the end users of this project. So I put their end users and also consumers because they're also the consumers. And I always like to put the target group in the middle of my mapping since they are the ones who will benefit or be affected most by the project and by the related impacts. To get in touch with these people, but also to eventually create better meal systems for them, the city of Bruges formed a collaboration with Rudderstove, a meal delivery organization in the region of Bruges, and Mintus, a care organization. Both can get the target group engaged in our project. VIVES was contacted for the research part of the project. Within the Center of Expertise for Agrotechnology and Biotechnology, we might conduct research on sustainable food strategies, but we can also conduct experiments with the consumers, such as taste tests. And then in the Center of Expertise for Social Innovation, we help in organizing co-creation sessions and in analyzing consumer needs through questionnaires or interviews. And we can also see the quadruple helix in the stakeholder mapping. So dark blue is academia consisting out of the research centers at VIVES. Orange in the middle is the target group, the consumers, and therefore representing the civil society from the quadruple helix. In brown, we have the governments, City of Bruges, and the public sector, Mintus. And in light blue, the business industry, Rudderstove. So I hope this is an example for you on how to do stakeholder mapping. Right now, I want to go to the impact planning tools we have in the guide to impact planning. So within the guides, we have 13 tools that you can use. I won't be able to go into detail for every one of them, but I will show you a quick view of the guide itself and how all these tools are listed there. There are various tools for impact planning available, and certainly not all tools that exist are within our guide, but we try to make a list with various types of tools. So there are references to books, ready-to-use templates, online guides. There is a MOOC, a massive open online course, blogs, podcasts, a training, workshops, manuals. All tools are developed by other institutions in various countries, but citation is always mentioned. Most tools are freely accessible. Some have limited free access and others are not free, but this is mainly the case with books or live trainings you could attend to. Most tools are available online. And we also indicate for every tool for whom this tool could be of interest. Some tools are made more for researchers, others are more user-friendly for citizens to use in developing an ID, for policymakers, for companies, and so on. Okay, so right now I would like to take you on a quick tour through the guide to impact planning. So I made a short video. I hope everyone can see it. If not, please let me know if it doesn't work. So I already scrolled down to the page with the list of impact planning tools here. You can see them, the 13 tools. And then if we go further, maybe it will go a bit fast, but it's just to give you a quick view. You can go into detail when you want later on. So here you see that we indicate for who the tool might be of use, and also the role of co-creation within the tool. So we have these boxes for every tool that is indicated in the guide to impact planning, these boxes with all kind of characteristics on the specific tool for you actually to choose which one would be most of interest to you, what type of tool you like most, There are also different languages sometimes available. So in the characteristics, we list if there are various languages available. Here it's in Dutch or in English. So this might be of use for some Dutch-speaking people. This is the MOOC I talked about, massive open online course. So you can get familiar with impact planning through a training. There's a handbook from Mark Reed. He also has a blog, podcasts, training videos, etc. And what we do is we provide links. You can just click on the link and then you will go to the tool itself. So you will be directed to the web page either, or directly to the template or the tool itself. So here I click on a web page. I'm directed to the web page for the Development Impact and You Toolkit. And I get all this information on this website. And here I can see the toolkit itself is downloadable in different languages. Well, I'll just click on the English one. It opens up. Then you've got the PDF file for the DIY toolkit, which you can print out. And there are these easy to use templates you can print out and just fill in. So it works like this. Every tool that is available within the Guide to Impact Planning has a link where you can click on, be directed to the website, to the template, to the tool itself. So this is how it works. But you can go through that when you have more time. I did have a second exercise prepared for you, but I don't know if there will be time to do the exercise. Helen, do you? Because we still needed some time for debrief and discussion afterwards.
I think we have how much time will your exercise take? I think we have like 8 minutes.
Yeah, I think 5 minutes would be fine actually.
Okay,
It's just, yeah, okay. So the second exercise is actually again with the idea or project or research you have in mind. And we are going to use this easy to use template from the University of Sheffield, which is freely available on their website. I shall put it in the chat box, and then you can just go into the Word document and type in yourself. So what I would like you to do is plan the impact for your idea or project research using this template. I will put it in the chat box. So you can get it at this link in the above right corner, but I will also try to give it right away if possible. I don't think it will be possible like this. Are you guys finding the template in the right above corner of the website? Okay, perfect. So you can just try to fill in some of these columns to get familiar with the idea of impact planning. And then I will just in 4 minutes give a brief example again to you. Meanwhile, when you are experiencing difficulties in filling out the template, you can always put them in the chat. I can answer in the chat, or if you have any questions regarding the Guide to Impact Planning, you could also put them in the chat already. Okay, so is anyone experiencing difficulties in filling out this template, or how do you perceive the template? Is it easy to use, or is it fairly new to you to do this kind of exercise? What are your experiences? You can put it in the chat, but if someone would like to take the mic, for me it's also fine. If you have an idea or you want to ask a question, you can also turn on your mic. Yeah, the evidence column, Mary, is indeed a very useful column. It makes you really think on how you will be able to measure the impact you want to make. So it's very important. Okay, I think I will just briefly give another example, and then the presentation will be at the end. Okay, So again, I will briefly show an example of a filled-in impact action plan. And I am using the example of the project I introduced before, so the Cities 2030 project. So here we see the template that is filled in. So what I try to do is I try to consider the impact that we want to have with our project, which could be, for example, that we want elderly people to be more prone to eat vegetarian meals, which would lower the consumption of vegetarian meat, which would lower carbon footprint. And who will benefit from this? Eventually, everyone will benefit from a smaller carbon footprint. So this is an example of impact we would like to have with this project. The pathway we need to take is we need to know why elderly people are less prone to eat vegetarian meals. So maybe we should do in-depth interviews or focus groups with elderly people to get to know this. But we also need to convince elderly people of the importance of lowering carbon footprint through changing our eating habits. The evidence, so how we want to measure this, actually, we could do it fairly easy by seeing how many elderly people are ordering vegetarian meals at Rudderstove at this point in time. And after we conduct our research or we had our project, we did the sessions to raise awareness. So when is the activities you may need to do and when they should happen? So first we need to know why elderly people are less prone to eat vegetarian meals. So we need in-depth interviews, co-creation sessions as well with stakeholders to create new and more sustainable food systems for meal delivery to elderly people, sessions to raise the awareness. Support, so what do we need? So the City of Bruges needed a research assistance for the in-depth interviews. We are also in need of knowledge on vegetarian food, knowledge on carbon footprint and sustainable food systems. But we as a research department, we are in need of organizations who could bring us together with or in contact with elderly people. And the barriers is also an important column to think about in advance. So the barrier that we could get involved or that we could have in our project is that there are not so many elderly people who want to collaborate in interviews, and those who do, who are interested in helping research, they might not be able to really specify why they have certain food preferences. I already had some research with elderly people, and they tend to have sometimes difficulties in elaborating on their IDs. So they can say that they like it or they don't like it, or they're used to it, but it's sometimes difficult to really elaborate on this. So in-depth interviews might not be the best type of method to get our insights. Okay, so here are the references to the guides I mentioned and the template from the University of Sheffield. So I want to thank you for your attention. The PowerPoint is already made available, and if not, it will be made available to you. And if you click on one of these pictures, you will be directed to the PDF files of the Guide to Impact Planning or the Guide to Co-Creation. So many thanks to all of you and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I think they can be addressed in the remaining time we got. Helen.
Thanks, Dewi.
Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Great. So I'm going to reshare my screen with a couple of housekeeping items. So after we've discussed some of the tools that are available to you, we just wanted to see, will you use one of these tools for your work currently? And certainly you can share this in the chat or maybe raise your hand on Zoom. It'd be great to find out if you guys found this helpful. And if you are going to use one of these tools for your work currently, which one of these tools will you use? I think personally for me, the plain language tool is very helpful, and I will certainly keep that in mind when I'm doing my mobilization products. Okay, so just moving on, as we do want to work on ourselves at Research Impact Canada, we do have an evaluation survey that we'd like to ask you to fill in. The link is provided in the chat from Julia Levine. And it's also, the link is available here on the presentation, as well if you happen to be tuning into the presentation via tablet or phone, you can use the QR code. I see that people are having a bit of trouble clicking on the eval link. Let me double check that in a couple of minutes, and I will get back to you shortly after the end of the presentation. But please do fill in the evaluation, because it does really help us learn what your needs are, as well as provide future training and resources. So I just wanted to say thank you to Srdjana and Dewi, who helped facilitate our tool workshops today, as well as Sarah Bassmer and Megan Heitman, who played an integral part in creating the Research Impact Canada and ARIS Knowledge Mobilization Toolkit. And lastly, but not least, if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to contact myself at the email hng23@yorku.ca, and please feel free to visit our website, follow us on Twitter, or email our email, which is info@researchimpact.ca. And as well, I wanted to take a moment to thank you, my colleagues at Research Impact Canada, for their support, Connie, Sylvia, and Julia. And I would like to remind people to please sign up for the Research Impact Canada newsletter to stay up to date with us. And the link will be provided by Julia in the chat again. And I see that people are still having trouble in accessing the evaluation. So I'm going to just double check that now, and I'm going to make sure that that's accessible to everyone. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to make sure that the evaluation is open, because I believe it should be. Thank you.